All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. You can settle on in. Wonderful to see everybody this morning. We're in the book of Matthew. If you want to go ahead and get your Bibles open there. On the desk back there, there's materials for this class. I don't want you to feel super married to this material. This material is going to be, there was a few mistakes in the printing and editing, I guess I should say, this material. So we're going to use this as a guideline. We're going to use this as a study aid, rather, but not necessarily as a schedule. If we followed this material in its entirety, we would finish this class roughly June 2026. So we're not going to follow this material word for word. Passed it out because, one, it's already printed, and two, it's still a helpful thing to have. We'll be referencing some of the questions. And each week beforehand, depending on where we leave off, I'll give guide towards using this material, where you should pick up, questions we should focus on, and such. So take the material, please reference it, but just know this is not a depiction of the schedule for this class. All right. So last week we started off in the Sermon on the Mount. We started off laying out some context. We want to go through that and just continually add the reminders of where we are, what we're doing from the book of Matthew. Matthew is a Jew, and he's writing this book to other Jews, and that's going to be a theme that we're going to want to notice and take particular note of in phraseology, different words that are deliberately used for that reason as we go through this text. Coming into this, one of the things that we talked about last time was the context for how Matthew's gospel is written. It's a big portion that other gospels reference is really kind of fast forwarded to get to the Sermon on the Mount. And we have the genealogy, we have the birth of Jesus, we have the temptation, we have some miracles, and then Sermon on the Mount. And so there's enough information in the book of Matthew so far to lay out the context that we should be really seeing a lot of correlations between Jesus and what Old Testament historical character? Moses. So as Matthew, a Jew writing to other Jews, it becomes, once you see it, it's hard to unsee that that's the correlation that he's drawing, that he's establishing Jesus for the reader as the deliverer. We can relate to him the same way we relate to Moses. Several examples. Yeah, we'll continue to kind of poke through that. Historically speaking, when the boys below a certain age were sent to be killed, they flee to Egypt, and then ultimately, eventually, returning as a deliverer, performing signs, and now ascending upon a mountain and delivering a law. And that puts us in this context of the Sermon on the Mount, where that is essentially what's happening. Some of the things that we also referenced last time was the way that we're going to be viewing this perspective from the Sermon on the Mount is from that of somebody who's been established in the law, someone who should be very familiar with the law. We talked about later in chapter 5, one of the first indictments that's listed through Jesus in this sermon is softening the tenets of the law. I didn't kill anybody, but I've harbored anger in my heart all this time. I haven't committed adultery, but my heart and my eyes are full of lust. The idea of turning the cheek, it's not just the black and white of an eye for an eye, but the sentiment there is to turn the other cheek, to not want to repay evil for evil. And so us, knowing how this book was written and who it was written to, should be coming into this perspective of this is what the kingdom of heaven should look like. And particularly, as today we go on through these Beatitudes, these are going to be a wonderful, beautiful summary. These are the norms of the kingdom of heaven. That term kingdom of heaven is almost exclusively used by Matthew, again in the idea of a Jew writing to Jews. The kingdom of heaven is something that was taken almost, theoretically, you could say, almost taken for granted as we go through the rest of this sermon. We're coming to this perspective of this is mine, it is mine by birth. But what does that mean as far as you actually live your life? Today we're going to be going on to the Beatitudes. We're going to try our best to get through all of them. And then we'll be moving on from there, starting in verse 13 next Sunday. Last week we finished off with the poor in spirit. And so we're going to do a quick recap on that and then jump right into verse 3 of chapter 5. So what were some of the I guess observations that we made? When the term saying blessed, first and foremost, the term beatitude means blessed. Numerous definitions you can find on what that term means or what beatitude means, and my personal favorite was complete happiness that comes from being blessed or made holy by God. So the idea of being blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What were some of the observations that we drew from last time?
We talked about that poor basically means lowly, humble in your spirit. So that was helpful in understanding.
Yeah. The word poor is synonymous with the word lowly. That's exactly right. And so it's not this idea of just being down. It's being humble. It's acknowledging your position before the Creator. Some of the examples we drew was imagine the opposite of being poor in spirit is, and that's being full of pride. Examples we do was back in Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, the idea of Nebuchadnezzar on the roof, confidently strutting about his kingdom, proclaiming, look what I did, look what I built, this is mine and I did this. And we'll see he's humbled very quickly after that. The church in Laodicea, thinking that they need to correct their attitude, they need to correct their heart, they need to humble themselves before the Lord. And the kingdom of heaven belongs to those, the point being made here is that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who acknowledge that gap between them and God. So, moving on to the next one, verse 4. So Matthew 5, verse 4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." What does it mean to mourn?
Mourning is to be filled with sadness or grief. We usually relate it to death, but that doesn't have to be the only connotation.
Yeah. It's not just being bummed out. You're mourning something. You're acknowledging something. You're acknowledging something deeper than just things are just a bummer. I'm down right now. It's blessed are those who mourn. This is more of a state of being. You've gone through grief, you've gone through loss. The idea of mourning is acknowledging the situation that you're in and feeling the weight of that situation on your shoulders. Go ahead and turn to Ezekiel 36. Coming in a very natural flow of being poor in spirit. We are poor in spirit. We're acknowledging we feel bankrupt, acknowledging the differences between us and our Creator, acknowledging what is and what should be. And a very smooth transition is to mourning as a result. Ezekiel 36, we'll start in verse 29. It reads, "And I will deliver you from all your uncleanness, and I will summon the grain and make it abundant and lay no famine upon you. I will make the fruit of the tree and increase the field abundant, that you may never again suffer the disgrace of famine among the nations." And 31, "Then you will remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, and you will loathe yourselves for your iniquities and your abominations. It is not for your sake that I will act, declares the Lord. Let that be known to you. Be ashamed and confounded for your ways, O house of Israel." What is Ezekiel saying here? Why should they be sad? Why should they mourn? Why should they feel this way?
Because they see the reality of their actions, prior actions, what they've done.
Yeah.
Especially in light of the blessings that God
There it
has
is.
just shown.
Yes.
Mourning is a situation in which you have no control, nor can you change the situation. So you're in desperate need of being comforted, but you have no way of being self-comforted.
Yeah. That's a great observation as well. The idea of you're in this position and acknowledging there's nothing, it's beyond your control to get out of this position. And that's a great example of what Ezekiel is saying here. I'm going to restore you. I'm going to make you whole. I will deliver you. I will provide for you. I will fulfill my promises. Then you'll remember your evil ways and your deeds that were not good, and you'll loathe yourselves for the iniquity and your abominations, despite the way that you conducted yourself, despite the way that you spit in my face, that you turned away from the law, from the commands. I will restore you. I will fulfill my promises to you. And that's essentially what is happening on the backside of this beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The idea of it's a state of being, and what's beautiful about this passage is that it's acknowledging that it's temporary. It's not something that will last. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Despite the status that you're in, despite how you got there, you will be restored. Romans 7, it's the same thought that Paul references in Romans 7. In verse 22, he says, "For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law weighing wars against the law in my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members." Verse 24, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" That's the first part of this beatitude. Wretched man that I am. There's a war waging within me. I'm stuck here. And then verse 25, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I serve the law of God with my mind, and with flesh I serve the law of sin." The idea is that's the back half of this parable. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Acknowledging that there is nothing in my status that I can do that will rectify this situation, but thanks be to God through Jesus Christ that there is salvation, that there is deliverance, and there are promises that are being fulfilled. Other comments on those who mourn and the promise of being comforted? Yeah, Jacob.
Looking at this as a parallel between Jesus and Moses and the deliverer, this is also Jesus' fulfilling prophecy. Really, multiple places in the Old Testament it talks about that the Messiah, the Lord's anointed, would come to heal the brokenhearted and comfort all who mourn. Isaiah 61, Ezekiel 9, Zephaniah, all through the Old Testament, we see pictures that when the Messiah comes, the deliverer comes to restore the kingdom, those who mourn will be comforted. So this doesn't come out of the blue.
Yeah, it's a great observation as well. Verse 5, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." This was an interesting one. There's no small amount of definitions of the word meek out there. When you hear the word meek, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Weak. What else? Yeah, meek as a mouse. When you hear the word meek, what hits you first?
It's not a good thing.
Yeah. Exactly. It's definitely not a compliment in today's language. So digging deep into this word, that's a much more modern translation. of the word, of this particular word that's used here. Modern translations are going to take that and refer to something like timidness, weakness. Digging back deeper, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of these words, but Mark Canner from Regent University had published a paper on this, and I thought it was really interesting, the way that he described it. So to go back and interpret this word into Greek, there was really two different routes that we could take this word. Blessed are the meek, and one is prautes, P-R-A-U-T-E-S, and praus. I think I didn't butcher those, maybe. The former is defined as an internal attitude, not an outward expression. So it's this mindset, and it's defined as a total lack of self-pride. It's nothing to do with weakness or incapability. It's one of humility. And then the other, P-R-A-U-S, praus, is defined as is a decided strength of disciplined calmness. If I had to pick one, I like the latter.
It's a conscious choice.
Yeah. It's
Most of the time people react in a violent way. It's a constant choice not to.
It's strength and power under control. It's discipline. It's something that's earned. It's something that is you work to maintain. We compare to Matthew 18 and verse 28 and through 30, where Jesus describes and says that I am gentle and humble, but I don't think we would describe Jesus as weak.
Moses was counted and described as being meek.
Yeah.
But meek in that sense has to do with what you're talking about. Meek was a leader in this case. He was stressed all the time in dealing with the nation that he had to lead.
Yeah.
But he was still calm, meek.
I'm glad you said that. That was actually my next point. It's just like comparisons that we can think of in Numbers 12. Moses is described as the meekest man who ever lived, burdened by leading the Israelites. And we have passages where we can see the way that that's written is just, you can see the humanity in these archetypal figures like Moses and the struggles that they had to go through, but still what they were able to accomplish by following the Lord, and the way that they were able to maintain a mindset by maintaining a relationship with the Lord. Another way to debunk the more modern definition of the word meek is that Jesus describes himself as meek. Think of Jesus hanging on the cross. What's weak about that? We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels. We know that's not the route that it had to go. So there's nothing weak or timid about the word meek. John, do you have anything?
Yeah, that second definition, the historical context that puts it in the best picture for me is it's the description of a war horse. So you have this massive, powerful entity, but they're not acting with their own power. They are referring their actions to another, to the one that is actually controlling them. So there's power and ability, but they're not taking it upon themselves to act on that.
You know,
they're fully in the directions.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I had that in here, but I didn't put it in there to try to save some time. That's my favorite definition of it, because I went back to Job to look up the definition of how God created a horse. And it's just this most powerful beast, that is designed that way on purpose. But when we think of a horse, we think of loyalty, we think of control, we think of strength, and we think of obedience and value. I think that's a wonderful representation. The idea of the war horse, the strength under control, being able to control yourself. The more interesting part, actually, before we move on, any other comments on the word meek itself? Yeah.
I was just going to comment that in personal relationships, if you are thinking about how's the concept of being meek important or embodied, I think is in a way that you can see that is when you have dealt with elders who are meek versus elders who are, we'll just say, not meek. The result is often, in both cases, there's leadership,
Yeah.
But elders who lead with meekness, they aren't weak. They don't allow untoward things to occur and maintain in a group.
Yeah.
But they approach it much differently than someone who feels that they are in charge and that they are powerful and that they can just, enforce their will. Instead, those men lead well in a congregation, and their meekness helps to create peace because it's under control, as opposed to attempting to bend the congregation's will to their own.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
And you can take that example and run with it in multiple directions. The first thing that comes to my mind is parenting. Like when I read this, and I think about like the kind of dad that I want to be for my kids, And Rose really tests it sometimes. But just the idea of being that meek. I want my kids to look at me as somebody who's strong, but as somebody who's controlled. If you're a volatile individual, there's no strength there. You're just uncontrollable. You're unpredictable. There's no reliance there. It's not a father. It's not a leader. And so this one, it breaks my heart that meek has become the word that it means today. Because the more I dug into this, the more I thought that is something to aspire to. Did you have your hand up?
I think you might get to this about inheriting the earth. Is that where you're going?
Yeah.
But, I was going to say that there's a parallel there to verse 9. They seem very similar to me. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God, and that word is mostly used as an adoption and inheritance word, sons. And Adam just said something about there's peace when there's meekness and an authority figure. So those seem very similar to me, and I know we'll get to verse 9 eventually, but I just want to
No, you're not wrong. There are a lot of similarities, and the idea of being adopted as sons through that implies kind of the same. It's just, you would hope that our creator, that our leader, that these Beatitudes, these norms of the kingdom of heaven, like these are the expectations, the characteristics of those who would make up the kingdom of heaven. You would hope that the leader, that the founder, the creator, our God, would bestow those same ideas. And if that's the one who's adopting us as children, that we would be able to pull that same from there. Anything else on meek? So I've always been puzzled at the result of meek, inherit the earth. I feel like in my mind, I imagine you always can interpret that a few different ways. Like of all the things that I could inherit that we're talking about eternity, earth isn't exactly on that list. And so taking some great conversation to help with Barry and some digging into this, the idea of inheriting the earth is going to mean something very different if you're Matthew writing to Jews who would be familiar with the old law, familiar with the context of the scriptures. And the idea is that this idea of inheriting the earth and God coming down to dwell with his people should be very similar to what we've seen also in the Exodus story. So in Exodus 25, you don't need to turn there, it's a very short verse. Exodus 25 in verse 8 reads from the start, from the Exodus story, as they're leaving Exodus 25, verse 8. And it says, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." The idea of God coming down to dwell in the midst of his people. Then in Revelation 21, 1-3 says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." The idea of the new heaven and the new earth has been the story from Exodus to Revelation, from Genesis to Revelation. The idea of God is coming down to dwell with his people. We can all pontificate on the nuances of how that's going to look, what that's going to be like. It's probably not the best use of your time. God wants to dwell with his people. What do God's people look like? What does his kingdom look like? They are meek. They're disciplined, they're strong, they're capable, they're knowledgeable, but they're controlled. They're loving, and they're kind, yeah.
I think this is a picture of taking us back to the garden. That's how it started. And that's how we can expect that to be, that God dwells with us. And so that's life for me.
It's a wonderfully fulfilling thought, the idea of from the beginning all the way to the end. It's been the goal. That's been what God's wanted. Yeah, Cal.
Yeah, building on that, I mean, in the garden, what separated them from God was trying to take control of the situation themselves instead of harnessing that control and letting God be in control, right? And so they lost their place in the garden when they did things the way they wanted to instead of being meek and humbling themselves to God.
Yeah. They acknowledged that they were capable of eating the fruit, but choosing not to do it because that was the command of the Lord. That's the difference. Yeah.
I think as we read these, it's really important to consider that I don't personally think we should think about these as like individual things. Like, well, David Lee, you'd like to inherit the earth. Okay, so you be me. And then, well, Adam, well, I'd like to be comforted, so I'm going to be mournful. Yeah. This isn't it's not like a menu that we're ordering from, and you're saying, well, I pick poor in spirit, meek, and merciful. Those are the ones I'm going for. You pick yours, and, somebody else pick theirs, and then these are the things we get for that.
Someone's got to pick persecuted.
Right. Yeah, someone's got to go with that. I don't like persecuted, so I'm not going to personally choose that.
Yeah.
But this isn't like individual things we choose from, and then we get a specific thing because of that. The description here, the purpose is to describe or give a picture of what kingdom citizens look like. Mm-hmm. And it's these couplets of you're like this and you get this are they're supposed to present a juxtaposition compared to what the Pharisees and the Jews of the day thought. Yeah. So you're going to get the kingdom because you're poor in spirit. You're lowly, well, you're going to have an inheritance. Well, that concept of being lowly was antithetical to what most of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law thought that they should be. They didn't think they should mourn and be sad for the pain that they've caused God. They didn't consider being meek. Instead, they wanted to show strength. So each of these things on the left is you need to choose something different than what is called normal for man and for the Pharisees. And then on the right side, the second part of all these couplets, is the things, they're all describing the same thing. But both sides. One describes the citizens of the kingdom, and one describes the rewards of the kingdom. But they're not taking them one by one to literally destroys what the purpose is here. Like very similar to the concept of qualifications of elders present a picture of a man that you would want to lead you and be in charge of your salvation. Yeah. And they shouldn't ever be kind of studied necessarily one by one. And like it's a whole picture. Yeah. And it's a whole picture of the kingdom and what we as citizens receive for being part of that.
That's a wonderful. First of all, it's a great reminder, especially because we're going to talk more about that next week as we come into the idea of Jesus' comment of, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so it really is this contextual knowing who this book is being written to and how those individuals would be reading this book is it's going to take them and really shake up what their thought process is on what success or what the kingdom of heaven looks like as far as a relationship with God is concerned at that time. But it's a great comment. Yeah, Kelly?
Yeah, I agree that these are all is the way to go about getting these things, it's actually the opposite in God's eye. Like, basically, man's wisdom is different from God's wisdom. And I like the idea of the upside down kingdom that Jesus presents, of like, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. Like, whatever you think is the right way to go about getting these things, Jesus says no, that there's a different way.
Yeah. I do love whatever. The way that these are written it really helps them make it a lot more relatable. Especially for us today. Like, you may be going through something, you may be going through loss or grief or struggling with the idea of being pure in heart. And you can read this and at least see the value in that, knowing that there is this kingdom that's not what you think it's supposed to look like. We've got to really get this idea of what you think a kingdom of heaven is and look at this to see here's what it actually looks like. And it's nothing like an earthly kingdom is ever going to look like for us here. We are running out of time. So we're going to go on to the next one of these. Blessed are those who hunger. It's verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Other translations, New King James says filled. They will be filled. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. So this one seems kind of self-explanatory, but what stands out to you about the result of the hungering and thirsting, the way that it's phrased?
Hunger and thirst is necessary for life.
Sure.
This is part of, you need it every day. And when you see injustices, you want to make it right.
Yeah.
You want to make it right, and that's it's just as natural as eating and drinking.
Sure, that's a great point. What else?
It's not a partial supply.
Yeah. I love that. And that didn't ever hit me until like it did when I was getting ready for this. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I'm a pretty hungry guy. I've always been more hungry. I've always wanted more. I have never been filled, satisfied. Maybe for a short period of time. But the idea of blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be satisfied. They will be filled. There's like a promise associated with this, where it's like you want something. It's if you crave this, if you hunger this, if you can't survive without this, you will be filled. You'll be satisfied. And this, for someone who's trying to find out, or who's reading this, it's like, well, I want to be filled. You're not going to find that in anything in this world. It's not there. It has eternal implications. It has short-term implications. We can look at the book of Ecclesiastes. The entire book is a whole manifesto of all the ways you'll never be satisfied. And the list is long. It's a big book. So the idea behind this hungering and thirsting for righteousness, there is something that is given by God that will satisfy you.
It's not really saying you can't get more in. What it's saying is when you add more, it overflows.
Yeah.
It's not like eating too much. With a physical sense, it's like becoming an abundant spring, like Barry when he gives a lesson on.
Yeah. So if you're in this situation, if you're in the position of, let's stick with the context. Let's imagine you're a Jew and you are looking up at the Pharisees and the scribes, and you know the ways that the law are implemented. You know that maybe it's injustices, maybe it's missing the point, and maybe you feel down about that. Maybe you're under the thumb of the Romans. You're in a weird position, and blessed are those, and you see this, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be filled. Isaiah 55. Come everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. He who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread, and your labor on that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good. Delight yourselves in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and that I will make you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. The idea of just come. It doesn't run out. You will be filled. You will be satisfied. There is something that does not, in this life, that does not lead to a dead end. And so, to start with the backside of that, the idea of being filled and satisfied, now going back to the front part of that is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I think those words are extremely deliberately used. It's not, blessed are those who are okay with it, or who see it, acknowledge that it's there. They're content with the fact that it exists. You crave it. You long for it. You cannot survive. Your being is not you without it. And God is in Isaiah 55 was saying, just come. It's an abundant supply. You can't run out. And the idea here in this passage, if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you're going to get it. You'll be filled. You won't get tired of it. And it's for here and on through eternity. Other comments on? Okay. Yeah, Jacob.
I read that word here for hunger is the same as in the previous chapter when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness. Meaning that this is like a starving kind of hunger, so there's an urgency to it rather than just a casual hunger. And also this reminds me just a lot of Brother McDonald's sermon last Sunday, where God's put eternity into our hearts. We all have a void within us, a God-shaped hole, if you will, that can only be filled truly by God. So it's really just, this is instructive to what does the world try to fill that void with, which is trash. And it was the dirty water last Sunday night versus seeking righteousness and being filled by the goodness of God.
Anything else? Yeah, Lou.
The last thing, what does it mean about the fully satisfied? Like, how, is it like after you die, you're satisfied, like into heaven, or is it like you get and receive? So how will you be satisfied? How do you recognize that you're satisfied?
My thought is yes. That is both. The idea of, well, even take the example of given last, like you can eat Oreos all day long. I mean, like, you'll probably feel gross. Your hunger will probably be mediated, but you're not going to be filled with meaning. You know, it's like your nutrients are not there. The things that you need to survive are not there. And so I think I think that there's, and someone else can feel free to comment on this, but I get the impression that there is short-term and long-term, like there are eternal implications of this, obviously. But I think there are also short-term implications of like this feeling of meaning, this feeling of being fulfilled. The things that you are actually desiring, the other stuff doesn't matter. The things that you actually want, if you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness, the things that will make you feel full, that make your life full of meaning, full of desire, it's not going to be found like anything that's in the book of Ecclesiastes. But it is found in the idea of pursuing righteousness. And so I get the impression that there's a satisfaction that's associated with this idea of being filled, and being full, and being made whole for that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could, if you take the hunger and thirst, and if you put anything else there, so if you could hunger and thirst for more money, you could hunger and thirst for a new iPad, you could hunger and thirst for a family, you could hunger and thirst for, kind of fill that with anything you want. And I think most of us, like, we can go read Ecclesiastes, but we can just also look to our lives. Anytime I've ever thought that the next promotion or the next house or the next whatever, whether that's physical or it's part of my family, I've always presented as well as if I just get to this next level, that must be the level where I'll be fine and everything's going to be good after that. And I think we've all discovered that we are wrong every single time. Every single time that we think something is going to produce satisfaction where we're just good after that, we find that we're wrong. And here, when it talks about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, you'll be satisfied. I actually think a part of that is the discussion that we'll be satisfied with all those other things. If I'm hungering and thirsting for righteousness, I'll no longer be thinking about, well, if I just get a little bit more money, I'll be happy. If I'm hungry and thirsting for righteousness, I'll no longer think, well, if I had a wife, or if I had a husband, or if I had children, or whatever, all of those things that we generally seek satisfaction in that fail, once we hunger and thirst for righteousness, we no longer worry about that satisfaction. And so we're satisfied not only because we get to love and learn about the Lord, but all those other things that ultimately produce a lack of satisfaction, we now no longer are distracted by those things, so that lack of satisfaction, that dissatisfaction is removed.
There is this idea of exclusivity to it. If you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness, you're probably not hungering and thirsting after manna.
That really helped. That helped me realize that the passages in Matthew talk about flesh never satisfies.
Yeah.
But I think some of the prophets said that
Thank you. That was
contentment.
Yeah.
Satisfaction is contentment.
well. First, I would definitely think that's at least a part of it. You know, if I'm hungering after this, chances are I'm probably not focusing on the dollar. I'm not focusing on the temporary things. That's it. Thank you for that comment, Adam. Yes, ma'am.
So, add to that is, I think in today's world, we spend so much time thinking about our physical desires or physical needs is what we hunger and thirst for, but we don't pay a whole lot of attention to our emotional and spiritual desires that are there. And we just kind of ignore them and pretend, I don't know, that somehow we can just say, oh yeah, we're content, but not actually paying attention to those needs and feeding those desires.
You know, and I think that's something that we should all shoulder a responsibility towards each other for. It's like making sure that we can see there is hunger and thirsting. You're hungering for righteousness in each other, and to be able to have those conversations. You know, it's one thing it's just a deeper aspect of a relationship, and I think that's something we can all help each other do as well. So thank you for that. Right. Blessed are the merciful. This is verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. There's a difference here between grace and mercy. D.A. Carson has a wonderful book that Barry gave me on this, and the definitions, the way he broke them down was, grace is a loving response when love is undeserved. Mercy is a loving response prompted by the misery and helplessness of the one whom the love is to be showered. So grace is the idea, I think we're all more familiar with just the textbook definition of grace. Unmerited favor, love that is undeserved but given regardless. Mercy is more of this acknowledging the state of being miserable and being able to forgive. It's what Mara was commenting on earlier. It's just like acknowledging that there's no way out of this situation. So to be merciful is to do more. It's an action to show mercy. Mercy is a loving response rather than this idea of just feeling pitiful or feeling pity for someone. It's an action. The parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18, where the first servant was forgiven all of his debt and then went and required it from someone else. The idea of being shown mercy and showing mercy is this idea of acknowledging someone who cannot get out of their situation, which should be us, which we referred to earlier, and expressing that towards them. So we're going to finish the Beatitudes next class, and we are going to start. So in your binders, in your books, we're going to do pages 12 and 13. That actually fits really well in our schedule where we're trying to go to. It's going to be Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. So do me a favor and just read Matthew 5 all the way through verse 20. We'll be ready for next week. Thank you much.